Will the bill that you send to the Senate have a $15 minimum wage in it?
Yes, it will.
It will?
It will, yes. We're very proud of that. As I said, 27 million people will get a raise, 70% of them women, and we will be sending that.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi Thursday confirming that a $15 federal minimum wage will be included in the COVID relief bill being sent to the Senate as a debate rages on Capitol Hill over the size and scope of President Biden's $1.9 trillion plan. The move comes as a new report by the Congressional Budget Office says that phasing in this mandatory wage floor by 2025 would put 1.4 million Americans out of work and add $54 billion to the federal deficit over a decade. Economist Douglas Holtz-Eakin is a former director of the Congressional Budget Office and the president of the American Action Forum. So, Doug, nice to see you again. You used to run that shop, the CBO. So what do you think of their 1.4 million job loss estimate? Sound plausible?
Very plausible. CBO's practice is to put its estimate in the middle of the range that you find in the research literature. So this is not a high ball by any means. It could be too low by a large margin. And one of the nice things about this CBO report is they really did lay out what goes on out in the private sector when you impose this mandate for a higher minimum wage. And it reveals that this is, in effect, a $500 billion mandate to pay higher wages, and that the way the private sector deals with this is it lays people off or doesn't hire them or cuts back their hours, and it shifts $130 billion of that mandate away, but you still end up with an over $300 billion mandate to the private sector. That's not a pro-growth move.
And the people the workers who will be most affected by this, historically, as I look at the literature, tend to be the young because they don't have the skills to be able to charge more than $15 an hour in some parts of the economy, and the least skilled. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. And at this moment, where do those people work? Well, typically in leisure and hospitality, retail and restaurants. And I don't know if you've looked out there, but that's where all the unemployment is. So this is a recipe to take those who've been most hurt by the pandemic and slow their ability to get back on their feet. It's really unwise in general, but particularly damaging right now.
Now let's talk about the size and the scope of this $1.9 trillion relief bill. Do you think, as an economic matter, that the economy right now needs this injection of money, as the Keynesians would put it, to goose consumer demand? Is that what the economy needs right now?
No, that's not the problem in the economy. We've had incomes rise through 2020. We've had wealth rise through 2020. People aren't spending because it's not safe to go out and risk infection and transmission of the virus. That's the key to return to normal economic activity. As we've done these large packages, the CARES Act, and then, remember, nearly $1 trillion just in December, the bulk of that has ended up in savings accounts. And so that money will ultimately come out. There's no real calculation that supports $1.9 trillion. It's a massive overreach, and the composition makes no sense from the perspective of Keynesian stimulus anyway. This is largely an agenda that's being driven by what they've always wanted to do on the left and are taking this opportunity to do it.
And that includes essentially a kind of income redistribution. You take a lot of money, you give it to the states, certain states. You take a lot of money, you give it for social welfare programs. There's a multi-employer pension bailout in here. There's a Medicaid expansion in here that kind of flows under the radar. And of course, you got $130 billion for schools, whether or not they reopen.
Yes. And now they're under orders to reopen. And so what's the money for? If it's safe for them to reopen, why are we spending $130 billion? I mean, none of this really makes sense. It adds up to a coherent policy that addresses the problems the economy has right now. And it's a real departure, I think, from what we saw in 2020. That was, in the big picture, an appropriately sized response. It was a response that targeted the problems out there in the economy and by and large worked. It wasn't perfect by any means, but I thought it really was a high watermark in the use of discretionary policy. It also left no permanent damage to the budget. If you go out 3 or 4 years, all of those CARES Act responses are gone. The things they did at the end of the year will be gone, and we'll be back with the unsustainable budget we had before, but we haven't added to that problem.
Well,
the 1.9 trillion, has lots of permanent components and would permanently make things worse off.
Well, I want to ask you about that long-term potential damage to the economy, because if you look at the federal debt held by the public as a share of the economy, meaning the kind you have to pay back because they're contracts, people buy treasuries, you have, it's now 100% of the size of the whole economy. That's unheard of except for wartime, World War II.
Correct.
And that's before this $1.9 trillion bill. So at what point does that magnitude of debt begin to have economically negative consequences?
Certainly the magnitude of debt that we have, and if we add another 1.9 trillion and perhaps even more later in the year, that magnitude of debt, when we get back to full employment, which won't be that long, is going to start to have an impact on the economy. The whole point of the borrowing is to move resources from the private sector into the government sector. Unless those government sector uses are just as productive as the private ones, that's a loss. And you have a steady incremental loss looking forward. It's a drag at best on growth in the economy. And if at some point you don't address the fundamental imbalance, it becomes a threat to financial markets, and the capital markets will react.
So you have the threat of tax increases, which should have a damaging economic effect. And then you have the potential, I guess, for potential inflation if down the line. Are those the two big risks you'd see?
I think there's a third risk as well. Those are on my list, but the third risk is financial instability. In the 21st century, the manifestation we've had in the economy that produces recessions has been a dot-com bubble in the early 2000s, a credit bubble, subprime mortgages, and the Great Recession. We've parked a lot of money out there in savings accounts over the past year because people can't spend it because of the virus. Right. I think it's gone right into financial markets, and if they put another $2 trillion out there, you run the risk of a Fed being way too loose given the bidding on equity assets, and I'm concerned about that.
Yeah, okay. So am I. Thanks, Doug Holtz.